The bell above the diner door chimed the way it always did. Too cheerful for 6 in the morning. Too loud for a place that smelled like burned coffee and old fryer oil. I tied my apron tighter and told myself, for the 100th time, that this was temporary. Just a job. Just a phase. Just something to pay the bills while I figured things out. I had been telling myself that for 3 years. The diner sat off a highway exit. The kind of place truckers loved because it never closed and never asked questions. Vinyl booths cracked with age. The counter stools wobbled if you leaned too far back. The menu hadn't changed since the early 90s, unless you counted the crossed out prices rewritten in thicker marker every few months. I was good at the job. Really good. I remembered regulars' orders, refilled coffee before they asked, and learned how to smile in a way that made people tip, even when they were in a bad mood. I could carry 4 plates on one arm and still dodge a kid running toward the restroom. I could tell who wanted small talk and who wanted silence. That kind of skill doesn't show up on resumes, but it's real. Still, every time I put on that apron, I felt like I was wearing proof of failure. I came from a family where success was measured loudly and publicly. Degrees framed on walls, promotions announced at dinner parties, jobs that came with business cards and titles people nodded at with approval. In that world, a diner uniform wasn't a stepping stone, it was a dead end. That belief had been made clear to me many times, but never more painfully than the morning my mother walked in. It was late morning, after the breakfast rush but before lunch. I was wiping down tables, hair pulled back, pen tucked behind my ear. The door chimed, and I looked up automatically, ready with my customer smile. Then I froze. She stood just inside the doorway, dressed the way she always was. Tailored coat, perfect posture, the faint scent of expensive perfume that didn't belong in a place like this. Her eyes scanned the room with thinly veiled discomfort, as if she might catch something just by breathing the air. For a second, I thought maybe she hadn't seen me yet, that she might turn around and leave. She didn't. Her gaze landed on me, and her expression tightened. Not with surprise, but with disappointment. The kind that had weight behind it, the kind that had been practiced. I walked over anyway, because that was my job. "Hi," I said, my voice professional, neutral. "Can I get you some coffee?" She looked at my apron, then at my hands, then back at my face. "I can't believe this," she said, not quietly. A couple in the corner booth glanced over. "Believe what?" I asked. Heat creeping up my neck. "This?" She gestured vaguely at me, at the diner, at the laminated menace. "This is where you ended up?" I swallowed. "Do you want a booth or—" "You know," she continued, cutting me off, "I told my friends you were still figuring things out. I didn't realize you were here." The word hung in the air, unfinished but sharp. I felt something inside me fold inward. Years of explanations, excuses, and hopeful future plans collapsed into a single small point. "I'm working," I said. "Can I get you something?" She sighed, the way someone does when correcting a child. "I suppose coffee. Black, and please don't call me On." "I don't call anyone Han," I said quietly. She slid into a booth, smoothing her coat, as if the vinyl might wrinkle it by association. As I poured the coffee, my hands shook just enough that I had to steady the pot. When I set the cup down, she looked around again. "This is embarrassing," she said. The word landed harder than anything else she'd said. Not disappointed, not concerned. Embarrassing. I felt my face burn. "You don't have to stay and make a scene," she replied. "That would be worse." I nodded, because that was easier than arguing. I went to the counter, rang up her coffee, and brought the check even though she hadn't asked. She frowned. "Already?" "Yes," I said. "I have other tables." She reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp bill, and set it on the table. No tip. As she stood to leave, she leaned in just enough for only me to hear. "You could have done better," she said. "You still can, if you stop wasting time." Then she walked out, the bell chiming behind her like punctuation. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty booth. Then I picked up the coffee cup, wiped the table, and kept working. Because that's what you do when you don't have the luxury of falling apart. What she didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that it was my last day. Not because I had finally failed enough to quit, but because I had already moved on. The job I had now wasn't the dream. It wasn't the goal. It was the cover. 3 years earlier, I'd taken the waitressing job after something else fell apart. A plan I had believed in, a path I thought was solid. When it collapsed, I needed money fast. The diner hired me on the spot. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Then temporary turned into routine. Routine turned into comfort. Comfort turned into fear. But somewhere between memorizing orders and learning how to read people, something else happened. I started noticing patterns. Customers talking about their businesses. Regulars venting about work. Truckers mentioning logistics problems. Sales reps complaining about outdated systems. I listened. At night, after double shifts, I went home and taught myself skills. Slowly, quietly. Online courses, borrowed books, trial and error projects. I failed a lot. I started over more times than I could count. I didn't tell my family. Every time I tried to explain something that didn't fit their definition of success, it turned into advice I hadn't asked for or concern that felt like criticism. So I stopped sharing. The diner paid the bills. The learning happened in the margins. Eventually, the margins added up. I started freelancing. Small projects at first, then bigger ones. Work that didn't care what I wore during the day or where I came from. Only whether I delivered results. Clients didn't ask where I worked when I wasn't working for them. When the income from that work matched my diner pay, I kept both. When it doubled, I kept quiet. When it tripled, I made a plan. I stayed longer than I needed to, partly out of caution, and partly out of something harder to admit. Fear of being seen again. Fear of failing publicly. Fear that if I left the diner and it didn't work out, I'd prove everyone right. The day my mother walked in was the day I realized I was already carrying the embarrassment she was worried about. And it wasn't coming from the apron. It was coming from living a life shaped by someone else's expectations. When my shift ended that afternoon, I untied my apron and folded it neatly. The manager asked if I could pick up an extra shift the next week. I smiled and said no. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I didn't announce my new work to my family. I didn't make a speech or send an email. I just stopped apologizing for being busy, stopped deflecting questions, let the silence do some of the work for me. Months passed. My work grew. So did my confidence. Not the loud, performative kind, something steadier. I learned how to say no, how to value my time, how to fail without spiraling. Eventually, my family noticed. At a gathering, someone asked what I was doing now. I answered honestly, simply, no defensiveness. There were raised eyebrows, skeptical nods, questions that sounded supportive but weren't. My mother listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That sounds different." I smiled. "It is." She didn't apologize. Not then. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe she didn't realize how sharp her words had been. But something shifted. Later that evening, she pulled me aside. Her voice was lower, less certain. "I didn't know you were planning all that," she said. I replied. "I just didn't know how to explain it." She nodded slowly. "I shouldn't have said what I said that day." "No," I agreed. "You shouldn't have." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I was afraid for you." "I know," I said. "But fear doesn't give anyone the right to shame someone else." She looked away, then back at me. Something like understanding crossed her face, not fully formed, but real. "I'm proud of you," she said, awkwardly. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the past. But it was enough. Revenge, I learned, doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to humiliate or hurt. The most lasting kind is quiet and patient. It's building a life so solid that the people who doubted you have to adjust their view of the world to make sense of it. The lesson I carry now is simple. But not easy dignity isn't granted by titles or approved by other people. Honest work is never shameful. And the paths that look unimpressive from the outside often require the most courage to walk. Success doesn't always look the way we were taught it would. Sometimes it looks like keeping your head down, learning in silence, and knowing exactly when to walk away without needing anyone's permission.